The sun dipped low over the wide plains of New Mexico, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Samuel wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, leaning on the worn handle of his hoe. Farming was lonely work, but it was all he knew. Each day bled into the next. Dust, sweat, and the sound of wind rustling through the wheat were his only companions. The farm stood miles away from the nearest town, a patch of land carved out of stubborn soil by sheer willpower and long days of toil. Samuel was not a young man anymore. Lines of weather and worry marked his face, and his shoulders carried the weight of years spent in silence. He remembered the laughter of his parents when he was a boy, the brief company of neighbors before they moved away, and the rare trips to town where folks greeted him politely, but never stayed to talk long. Life had narrowed itself to a cabin, a field, and the endless horizon. That evening, when the sun's fire began to fade, Samuel noticed something unusual at the edge of his property. At first, he thought it was an animal moving through the tall grass. But as he stepped closer, hoe gripped like a weapon, he realized it was a woman. She stood half hidden in the shadows, swaying slightly, as if too weak to run. Her dark hair was tangled and matted, her clothes torn, and her moccasins coated in dust from long miles traveled. She was Apache. Samuel's heart kicked against his ribs. He had heard the stories townsfolk whispered about raids and skirmishes, but looking at her now, he saw no warrior with fire in her eyes. Instead, he saw a woman no older than her 20s, weary and wounded, her arm wrapped tight with a strip of cloth already soaked through with blood. Her eyes, sharp and dark, watched him with the caution of someone who had learned not to trust too quickly. Samuel raised his hand slowly, showing he held no weapon. "You're hurt," he said, his voice rough from days of silence. She flinched at the sound but didn't move away. Her hand hovered near a small knife at her belt, yet the tremor in her body betrayed exhaustion. She was running on willpower alone. "I mean no harm," Samuel continued. He gestured toward the cabin. "Water. Shelter, that's all." For a long moment the woman didn't move. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the chirping of crickets and the sigh of the evening wind. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, she followed him toward the cabin. Samuel noticed the limp in her walk, the way her breathing came. Shallow, and he knew she would not have lasted much longer in the open plains. Inside, the cabin was plain but sturdy. A wooden table, a chair, and a narrow bed filled the space. Samuel fetched a tin cup, filled it with water, and set it on the table. The woman's eyes lingered on him as though expecting a trick, but thirst overcame hesitation. She drank deeply, her hands trembling as the water touched her lips. Samuel turned away to give her space, setting a kettle on the stove. He found an old shirt of his, rough but clean, and laid it on the bed. "For your arm," he offered gently. "You'll need to change the bandage." She looked at the shirt, then back at him. Her eyes softened just slightly, though suspicion still lingered. She took the fabric and began unwinding the bloody cloth from her wound. Samuel caught a glimpse of the gash, deep, angry, and raw. Likely from a fall, maybe even from a bullet. He said nothing, not wanting to press her with questions she wasn't ready to answer. For the first time in years, Samuel's cabin was no longer silent. The crackle of the fire, the clink of the cup, and the quiet presence of another soul filled the emptiness. It was strange, almost unsettling, but it stirred something in him, something he thought he had long buried beneath years of solitude. That night, as the prairie winds whispered against the wooden walls, Samuel sat in his chair while the woman rested on his bed, wrapped in a spare blanket. She kept her knife close, her body tense, but exhaustion finally pulled her into uneasy sleep. Samuel watched the shadows play across the floor and thought of how quickly life could shift, from loneliness to unexpected company, from silence to the fragile sound of breathing that was not his own. He didn't know her name, her story, or why fate had brought her bleeding and weary to his farm. But as he sat there, listening to the rhythm of her breathing, Samuel knew one thing for certain. For the first time in years, his cabin carried more than the echo of his own footsteps. The first morning after she came, Samuel woke earlier than usual. The light of dawn spilled over the plains, painting the fields in gold. He had grown used to the silence of waking alone, but now he heard the quiet shuffle of someone moving about in his cabin. For a moment he wondered if it had all been a dream. The Apache woman at his table, the weary eyes that had watched him so warily. But when he stepped into the main room, there she was. She had kindled the fire again, crouched beside it, stirring the embers into life. Samuel noticed how carefully she moved, cautious not to disturb him, almost as if she still wasn't sure she was welcome. "You didn't have to," he said softly. She looked up, the morning light catching the sharpness of her cheekbones. For a second, her expression was unreadable. Then she gave the faintest nod, as if to say she understood. Words between them were scarce at first. She spoke little English, and Samuel knew nothing of her tongue. Yet as the days passed, they discovered a language beyond words. She began to help him in small ways. At first, she only gathered water or swept the floor, but soon she followed him to the fields. Samuel showed her how to mend the fences that leaned under the prairie winds, how to guide the stubborn mule when it balked at the plow. She watched with intent eyes, then mimicked his motions with surprising ease. One afternoon, when Samuel's hand slipped and a splinter lodged deep in his palm, she caught his wrist with gentle but firm fingers. She held his calloused hand in hers, pried the splinter out, and pressed a cloth to the spot. Her touch was steady, deliberate, and warm. Samuel sat still, watching her brow furrow in concentration, and realized with a jolt that it had been years since anyone had touched him with such care. The cabin changed with her presence. The meals grew richer. She taught him ways to season the stews with wild herbs she gathered from the plains. The air filled with sounds unfamiliar to him. Her soft humming while she worked, her low laughter when the mule made a fool of itself, the rhythm of footsteps that no longer echoed solitary across the wooden floor. At night, when the fields lay under a blanket of stars, Samuel would sometimes catch her sitting just outside the cabin, her face tilted toward the sky. She seemed lost in thought, her expression caught between sorrow and peace. He never asked about her past, where she had come from, what wound had driven her to the edge of his land, but he could feel the shadows that lingered in her. And yet, in her presence, his own shadows grew lighter. Weeks slipped into each other. One evening, after a long day in the fields, Samuel sat with her at the table. His hands were raw from rope and soil, but when she reached across to pass him bread, her fingers brushed his. The simple contact struck him with the force of memory, of what it felt like to be seen not as a tool of labor, not as a man merely surviving, but as someone worth reaching for. Her eyes lingered on his, and for the first time Samuel saw no caution there, no guarded distance, only warmth. He realized then that he hadn't just opened his cabin to a stranger, he had opened his heart without even knowing it. She had slipped into his days like rain on parched soil, soft and steady, and suddenly everything around him had begun to grow again. The change was subtle but undeniable. Samuel laughed more, even at small things. He found himself talking to her about the sky, about the years of working the land, about the sound the wheat made when the wind ran through it. She listened, not always understanding the words, but always meeting his gaze with a quiet patience that said she cared. Her presence gave him something he hadn't realized he was starving for: belonging. Not just company, not just help on the farm, but a reason to look forward to each sunrise. One evening, as the two of them stood on the porch, the fields stretching endless and golden before them, Samuel spoke the words that had been building in his chest. "You've given me more than I ever thought I'd have again," he said, voice low and rough. "This place, my life, it was empty before you. Now it feels like home, not just land, not just work. Home." The Apache woman turned to him, her dark eyes softening, and though she said nothing, her hand slipped into his. The touch was simple, but it carried the weight of a promise. Beneath the endless New Mexico sky, Samuel finally understood what it meant to be seen, not as a farmer, not as a lonely man, but simply as himself. And in the quiet strength of her presence, he found what he had long been missing. He hadn't just offered her water and shelter, she had given him something far greater: belonging.